August 2, 1943, 11:47 p.m. Near Krymskaya, Soviet Union, Junior Lieutenant Nadezhda Popova eases her Polikarpov Po-2 biplane into a shallow dive, cutting the engine to idle. The small wooden aircraft, designed as a training plane and crop duster, glides silently through the darkness toward German positions 800 meters below. Behind her, navigator Katya Ryabova leans over the side of the open cockpit, watching the ground through the darkness, 4 small bombs secured beneath the lower wing. The Po-2 is laughably obsolete. Maximum speed barely 90 miles per hour, constructed of wood and fabric, with no radio, no guns, no armor, no parachutes. The Germans call it a sewing machine because of the distinctive sound its engine makes. But gliding with engine idled, it makes almost no sound at all, just the whisper of wind over fabric-covered wings. Below, German troops of the 17th Army are dug into defensive positions. Some sleep, others stand guard, watching for Soviet attacks. They don't hear the approaching aircraft until it's directly overhead. At 400 meters altitude, Popova pulls the bomb release. 4 50-kilogram bombs fall away. She immediately pushes the throttle forward. The small engine coughs, sputters, then roars to life. The Po-2 climbs away as the bombs detonate below, creating 4 brilliant flashes in the darkness. Machine gun tracers arc upward, trying to hit the already departing aircraft. Popova banks left, climbing back to 1,000 meters. Behind her, several more Po-2s are approaching the target on their own attack runs. Throughout the night, this pattern will repeat. Silent approach, engine idling, bombs dropped, engine restarted, escape. 20, 30, sometimes 40 sorties per crew in a single night. The Germans have learned to fear these nighttime attacks. They've given the Soviet women flying these missions a nickname, Nachthexen, night witches. Popova glances at the fuel gauge. Enough for 4 more sorties before they must return to base for refueling and rearming. She turns the Po-2 back toward the target area. The night is young, and there's much more work to do. In 1941, as Nazi Germany invaded the Soviet Union, the Soviet military faced catastrophic losses in personnel and equipment. The initial German offensive destroyed thousands of aircraft, killed or captured hundreds of thousands of soldiers, and threatened Moscow itself. In this desperate situation, Soviet command began considering measures previously rejected, utilizing women in combat roles. Soviet society had somewhat greater acceptance of women in military roles than Western nations, partly due to communist ideology emphasizing equality and partly from necessity. During the Russian Civil War from 1918 to 1922, some women had served as combatants. But by 1941, women in the Soviet military were largely restricted to medical, communication, and support roles. Marina Raskova, a famous Soviet aviator who had set numerous flying records before the war, petitioned Stalin directly to form all-female aviation units. Raskova argued that women could fly combat missions as effectively as men, freeing male pilots for other duties. Stalin, desperate for any combat capability, approved the formation of 3 all-female aviation regiments in October 1941. The 586th Fighter Aviation Regiment flying Yak-1 fighters, the 587th Bomber Aviation Regiment flying P-2 dive bombers, and the 588th Night Bomber Aviation Regiment. The 588th would become the most famous and most decorated of these units. It was assigned Obsolete Po-2 biplanes, 2-seat aircraft with open cockpits designed for training and agricultural use, never intended for combat. But the Po-2 had certain advantages for night harassment bombing. It was simple, reliable, could operate from rough fields, could fly very slowly allowing precise bombing, and most critically, when flown with engine idled, it was nearly silent. The mission of the 588th was night harassment, attacking German positions, supply depots, headquarters, and troop concentrations during darkness, denying rest to enemy forces, destroying supplies, and disrupting operations. Each aircraft carried only small bombs, typically 4 50-kilogram bombs, but flying multiple sorties per night, an entire regiment could deliver significant ordnance. The women of the 588th faced extraordinary challenges. They operated obsolete aircraft that offered no protection whatsoever. They flew at night in all weather conditions without radio navigation aids. They had no parachutes. Weight restrictions and lack of availability meant crews flew without them. They faced German anti-aircraft fire, night fighters, and the constant risk of navigation errors or mechanical failure. And they did this night after night, sometimes for years. Marina Raskova, 30 years old in 1941, was the driving force behind the women's aviation regiments. A celebrated aviator who had set long-distance flight records, Raskova had both the fame and the political connections to convince Stalin to approve the formations. She initially commanded the 587th Bomber Regiment until her death in a flying accident in January 1943. Her legacy continued through the units she created. Major Yevdokia Krymskaya commanded the 588th Night Bomber Regiment from its formation until war's end. A pre-war flying instructor, Krymskaya was an exceptional leader who maintained unit cohesion and morale through years of combat. Under her command, the 588th flew over 23,000 combat sorties and produced 23 heroes of the Soviet Union, the highest Soviet military decoration. Nadezhda Popova joined the regiment at age 19 and became one of its most prolific pilots, flying 852 combat missions and surviving the entire war. She was shot down multiple times, crash-landed repeatedly, and continued flying. Her determination and skill made her legendary within the regiment. Yevgenia Zhigulenko flew over 800 combat missions and survived being shot down 4 times. Her navigator, Klavdia Fomisheva, remained her constant crew partner through years of combat, a testament to the close bonds formed between pilots and navigators. Irina Sebrova held the record for most combat sorties in the regiment, 1,008 missions flown. To accomplish this, she frequently flew 10 or more missions per night throughout the war. Yekaterina Ryabova served as navigator and later pilot, flying over 800 missions. She survived the war despite the Po-2's extreme vulnerability through skill, luck, and sheer determination. On the German side, the soldiers who faced these night attacks learned to respect and fear them. German accounts describe the psychological impact. Constant nighttime attacks preventing rest, creating pervasive anxiety, the eerie sound of approaching biplanes cutting through darkness. The nickname Night Witches reflected both grudging respect and the unnerving nature of the attacks. October 1941 to May 1942, over 2,000 women applied for the 3 aviation regiments. Marina Raskova personally interviewed many applicants, selecting approximately 400 for training. For the 588th Night Bomber Regiment, she chose women with flying experience, flight instructors, flying club members, and aviation enthusiasts. The youngest was 17, the oldest in their mid-20s. Training began at Engels, a military aviation school near Saratov. The women learned military discipline, navigation, bombing techniques, and advanced flying skills. They were issued men's uniforms, several sizes too large, which they altered themselves. They were issued boots sized for men, which they stuffed with newspapers or rags to make fit. The equipment shortage extended to everything: inadequate winter clothing, minimal supplies, and ancient aircraft. The Po-2 biplane, their assigned aircraft, was universally known but never intended for combat. It was a simple design: fabric-covered wooden frame, 2 open cockpits with pilot in rear and navigator bombardier in front, a single 115-horsepower engine, maximum speed 94 miles per hour, service ceiling 10,000 feet. It carried no weapons except the bombs attached beneath the lower wing. There was no radio. Communication between aircraft was impossible during flight. Navigation was by map, compass, and visual landmarks. But the women learned to use the Po-2's characteristics advantageously. Its slow speed allowed precise flying at night. Its low stall speed meant it could land and take off from small, rough fields. Its simplicity meant maintenance could be performed quickly with minimal tools. And most critically, when the engine was throttled to idle during the attack dive, the aircraft became nearly silent, invisible and inaudible until bombs were already falling. The bombing technique was simple but required precision. Approaching the target at 1,000 to 1,200 meters altitude, the pilot would reduce power to idle and glide toward the target. The navigator, in the forward cockpit, would sight the target and direct the pilot. At 400 to 600 meters altitude, the navigator would release the bombs, and the pilot would immediately apply full power and climb away. The entire attack occurred in darkness without lights, relying entirely on the crew's ability to judge altitude, distance, and timing visually. Training emphasized these techniques until they became instinctive. Crews practiced night navigation, flying by dead reckoning across unfamiliar terrain. They practiced emergency landings, critical since the Po-2's reliability was marginal and forced landings were common. They learned to service their aircraft personally, fueling, loading bombs, performing basic maintenance. By May 1942, the 588th was declared combat-ready and deployed to the southern front near Rostov. The regiment consisted of approximately 40 Po-2 aircraft and 115 personnel, pilots, navigators, mechanics, armorers, and support staff. All were women, from the commanding officer to the mechanics servicing aircraft. This was unusual even in the Soviet military, which employed women extensively but typically in support roles or mixed units. June to December 1942. The 588th's first combat missions occurred in June 1942 near Rostov-on-Don. The missions were simple: attack German positions to prevent rest and resupply. Each aircraft carried 4 50-kilogram bombs. With 40 aircraft available, the regiment could theoretically deliver 160 bombs per mission. But the real effect came from repetition. Crews flew multiple sorties per night, returning to base to refuel and rearm between missions. A typical night's operations began at dusk. Mechanics prepared aircraft, fueling from hand pumps, loading bombs one at a time, checking engines and control surfaces. Crews received mission briefings, target location, approach routes, flak positions, alternate targets. As darkness fell, the first aircraft took off. Flying to the target area took 30 to 60 minutes depending on distance. Crews navigated by map and visual landmarks, rivers, roads, villages, fires from previous bombings. Once at the target area, they circled at altitude while identifying specific targets. Then began the attack dive. Engine throttled to idle, aircraft gliding down silently, navigator sighting the target, bombs released, engine restarted, escape climb. German anti-aircraft response was initially confused. The Po-2s flew too slowly for radar-directed guns designed for conventional bombers. Optical sights couldn't track such slow targets. Searchlights often couldn't find the small, fabric-covered aircraft. When searchlights did illuminate a Po-2, it was shockingly vulnerable. Fabric wings, open cockpits, no armor. A single burst of machine gun fire could destroy it. But hitting such a small, slow-moving target at night proved difficult. By autumn 1942, Germans had adapted their defenses. They positioned anti-aircraft machine guns around likely targets and along approach routes. They used searchlights more effectively, concentrating beams to create illuminated cones the Po-2s couldn't avoid. Some units deployed night fighters, Mi-109s, and FW-190s flying patrol patterns to intercept the slow bombers. The Po-2's vulnerability became apparent. On August 1, 1942, Olga Samfirova and navigator Antonina Koklova were shot down and killed, the regiment's first combat deaths. More losses followed. Crews shot down rarely survived. The lack of parachutes and armor meant hits were usually fatal, but the missions continued. The psychological impact on German forces was significant. Soldiers who needed rest couldn't sleep, due to constant bombing. Supply dumps had to be dispersed and camouflaged. Headquarters moved frequently to avoid targeting. The material damage from 50-kilogram bombs was limited, but the cumulative harassment effect was substantial. By December 1942, the regiment had flown over 3,000 sorties. They'd lost 12 aircraft and 24 personnel, but they'd also proven their effectiveness. Soviet command expanded their mission scope and moved them to critical sectors as needed. September 1942 to February 1943. The 588th participated in the Stalingrad campaign, attacking German positions around the besieged city. The urban combat environment created both opportunities and challenges. German forces were concentrated in relatively small areas, making targeting easier. But anti-aircraft defenses were also concentrated, making attacks more dangerous. Nadezhda Popova flew multiple missions per night throughout this period. She later recalled, "We'd fly 8-10, sometimes 12 missions in one night. Land, refuel, reload bombs, take off again. The mechanics worked in darkness. We couldn't show lights. We'd navigate to Stalingrad, find our target, make the attack, return, and do it again." Night after night, for months, the physical exhaustion was extreme. Pilots and navigators operated on minimal sleep, flying several hours per night, then preparing for the next night's missions. The open cockpits meant exposure to cold, temperatures often well below freezing at altitude. Frostbite was common. The women stuffed newspaper under their flight suits for insulation, wrapped their faces in scarves, and wore multiple layers of clothing. Still, after hours in open cockpits at night in Russian winter, they'd land barely able to move from cold. The danger intensified. German night fighters increasingly patrolled around Stalingrad. The Po-2's slow speed, which made it hard to hit with anti-aircraft fire, also made it unable to escape fighters. When intercepted by a Mi-109, the only defense was violent maneuvering, turning tightly, diving to treetop level, using darkness and ground terrain to break contact. Sometimes it worked, often it didn't. Yevgenia Zhigulenko was shot down twice during the Stalingrad campaign. The first time, she crash-landed in a field, and she and her navigator walked back to Soviet lines through German-held territory. The second time, her aircraft caught fire. She managed to land it, and both crew members escaped before it exploded. Both times, she was back flying within days. The regiment's contribution to the Stalingrad campaign was recognized officially. Multiple crews received decorations, but the real measure of effectiveness was German acknowledgement. Prisoners captured after Stalingrad's conclusion reported that the constant night bombing had made rest impossible and contributed to general exhaustion. Throughout 1943 to 1945, as the war progressed, both the 588th tactics and German countermeasures evolved. The women developed increasingly sophisticated techniques to survive and maintain effectiveness. One key tactic was the use of decoys. When attacking well-defended targets, two Po-2s would approach simultaneously. One would fly slightly higher and deliberately attract searchlights and anti-aircraft fire. While defenses focused on the decoy, the second aircraft would make the actual attack from a different angle. The decoy would then escape while defenses reoriented. The roles alternated between crews. Everyone took turns as decoy and attacker. Another technique exploited the Po-2's extreme slow flight capability. When illuminated by searchlights, pilots would sometimes reduce speed to minimum, barely above stall speed, making the aircraft even harder to track with anti-aircraft sights calibrated for faster targets. This was extremely dangerous. At minimum speed, the Po-2 was one gust of wind or control input away from stalling and spinning, but it worked. Navigation techniques improved through experience. Crews memorized terrain features, approach routes, and defensive positions. They learned to identify targets by shape and shadow, even in minimal moonlight. Experienced navigators could estimate altitude and distance accurately enough to bomb without instruments. The women also developed close coordination despite lacking radios. Through repetition and mutual understanding, pilots and navigators worked as seamless teams. Navigators learned each pilot's tendencies and compensated. Pilots trusted navigators, bombing judgments implicitly. German countermeasures continued evolving. They learned to position searchlights and anti-aircraft guns in overlapping patterns, creating boxes of fire the Po-2s couldn't avoid. They developed patrol patterns for night fighters that intercepted common approach routes. They deployed barrage balloons, cables suspended from balloons at various altitudes, creating obstacles that could destroy low-flying aircraft. Losses continued. On average, the 588th lost 3 to 5% of its aircraft per month, a sustainable rate given replacements, but one that meant few crews survived the entire war without being shot down at least once. The lack of parachutes meant that being hit was often fatal. Crews who survived crashes sometimes suffered severe injuries. The emotional toll of losing friends regularly was intense, yet morale remained high. The women believed in their mission. They'd volunteered for combat duty when they could have remained in safer roles. They drew strength from each other. The all-female composition created bonds and solidarity, and they took pride in their effectiveness. They knew German troops feared them, knew their attacks disrupted enemy operations, knew they were contributing to victory. The 588th participated in every major Soviet offensive on the southern and eastern fronts from 1942 until war's end. The Caucasus campaign in 1943, attacking German forces in the Caucasus Mountains, often flying in terrible weather conditions through mountainous terrain at night. The navigation challenges were extraordinary. Mountains invisible in darkness created deadly hazards. Several aircraft were lost to controlled flight into terrain. The liberation of Crimea in 1944. Intensive operations supporting the Soviet offensive that drove German forces out of Crimea. The regiment flew from improvised airfields, sometimes moving locations daily to stay close to advancing troops. The Belarusian offensive in 1944, supporting Operation Bagration, the massive Soviet offensive that destroyed German Army Group Center. The 588th flew hundreds of missions in support of advancing troops, attacking German rear areas and supply lines. The Vistula-Oder offensive in 1945, the final push into Germany itself. By this stage, German air defenses were weakening due to fuel shortages and loss of experienced crews, but the 588th still faced significant dangers. They flew missions against targets in Poland and eastern Germany. Throughout these operations, the basic mission remained consistent: night harassment bombing. Individual sorties were small-scale, 450-kilogram bombs per aircraft, but the cumulative effect of hundreds of sorties per night, night after night, month after month, was significant. German forces facing the 588th operations reported constant exhaustion, reduced effectiveness, and persistent anxiety from the unending night attacks. The women of the 588th left numerous memoirs and interviews describing their experiences. Their accounts provide insight into the daily reality of flying obsolete aircraft in combat. On fear, Nadezhda Popova stated, "Of course we were afraid. Anyone who says they weren't is lying, but we learned to control fear to function despite it. After the first few missions, fear became familiar. You acknowledged it, then did your job anyway." On being women in combat, Irina Sebrova recalled, "Male soldiers were often surprised to see us. They'd expect men and find women. Sometimes they were patronizing, assuming we were there for morale or propaganda. Then they'd watch us fly mission after mission through flak, and their attitudes changed. We earned respect through actions, not words." On losses, Yevgenia Zhigulenko described, "When friends were shot down, we couldn't dwell on it. We'd mourn briefly, then prepare for the next mission. Otherwise, the grief would paralyze us. After the war, the losses hit harder. During the war, we survived by focusing on the mission. On the aircraft, Multiple pilots noted their attachment to the Po-2 despite, or because of, its limitations. One stated, the Po-2 was slow, obsolete, and vulnerable, but it was also simple, reliable, and forgiving. It brought us home when by rights we should have died. We loved those little planes. On German opponents, accounts described respect for German anti-aircraft crews and night fighter pilots. There was acknowledgement that Germans defending against the attacks were doing their duty, just as the Soviet women were. But there was also satisfaction in the psychological impact. We knew we were in their heads. They feared the nights because of us. April to May 1945. By April 1945, Soviet forces were approaching Berlin. The 588th moved westward with advancing troops, establishing temporary bases in Poland and eastern Germany. Missions continued against remaining German positions, though resistance was weakening. The final combat missions occurred in early May 1945, just days before Germany's surrender. These missions had less tactical importance. The war's outcome was certain, but crews flew them with the same professionalism and courage as earlier ones. On May 8, 1945, Germany surrendered. The 588th had survived from 1942 to war's end, 3 years of continuous combat operations. The unit statistics were extraordinary. 23,672 combat sorties flown, 3,000 tons of bombs dropped, 28 aircraft lost to enemy action, plus others to accidents. 23 heroes of the Soviet Union awarded, the highest decoration, multiple other decorations for hundreds of personnel. Of the women who served in the regiment, approximately 30 were killed in action or died in accidents. Many more were wounded. Given that the regiment operated obsolete aircraft without armor or parachutes against enemy defenses for 3 years, the survival rate was remarkably high, testimony to skill, tactics, and perhaps luck. With war's end, the 588th was formally disbanded. The women returned to civilian life, often to find society unprepared to acknowledge their service. Soviet propaganda had publicized the women's aviation regiments during the war, but peacetime brought different attitudes. Many veterans found that their combat service was dismissed or minimized. Some faced skepticism that they'd actually flown combat missions. The Po-2 biplanes were retired, most scrapped, a few preserved for museums. The aircraft that had seemed obsolete in 1941 and remained obsolete throughout the war had nonetheless proven effective in its specialized role. No one proposed continuing to use Po-2s for combat operations, but the women who flew them had demonstrated that with proper tactics, even obsolete equipment could be effective. The 588th Night Bomber Regiment's legacy extended far beyond its tactical contributions. Proof of capability, the regiment definitively proved that women could perform combat aviation duties as effectively as men. The statistics, 23,000 plus sorties with acceptable loss rates, demonstrated competence equal to male units performing similar missions. Tactical innovation, the development of night harassment tactics using obsolete aircraft showed creative adaptation. Other nations studied Soviet night harassment techniques, though few replicated them exactly. Psychological warfare, the regiment's psychological impact on German forces was disproportionate to the material damage inflicted. The disruption of rest, the constant anxiety, and the inability to prevent the attacks affected German combat effectiveness and morale. Women in combat. The 588th became perhaps the most famous female combat unit in World War II. Their service challenged assumptions about women's capabilities in warfare and influenced post-war debates about gender roles in military service. Recognition, post-war Soviet Union officially honored the regiment's service. 23 heroes of the Soviet Union and numerous other decorations acknowledged their contributions. Museums preserved their aircraft and memorabilia. Veterans were celebrated, though sometimes only decades later. The women themselves, in post-war interviews, often downplayed their achievements. They emphasized that they'd simply done their duty, performed their mission, and contributed as best they could. Many expressed pride not in individual accomplishments, but in collective achievement. The regiment had performed its mission for 3 years, had proven effective, and had survived. Modern assessments acknowledge both the regiment's genuine effectiveness and the propaganda value the Soviet Union derived from publicizing all-female combat units. Both aspects were real. The women flew real combat missions against real opposition and suffered real casualties. Simultaneously, Soviet authorities highlighted the units for propaganda purposes. These truths coexist. The tactical question of whether obsolete biplanes flown by women on night harassment missions significantly affected the war's outcome is debatable. Individual missions inflicted limited damage, but cumulative effect over 3 years, 23,000 sorties, constant harassment, disrupted rest, psychological impact, likely contributed meaningfully to Soviet successes on sectors where the regiment operated. Perhaps the most important legacy is symbolic. The Night Witches demonstrated courage, competence, and determination equal to any combat unit in any nation's military. They operated at the edge of human endurance in obsolete aircraft against dangerous opposition for years. They proved that combat effectiveness derives from skill, training, and determination, not gender.